Today I'm here with Naomi Paik, an associate professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's the author of the award-winning 2016 book, Rightlessness: Testimony and Redress in U.S. Prison Camps Since World War II. And her new book, Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary: Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century, is forthcoming this month, May 2020. And it examines the long-developing criminalization of foreign-born people in the United States. Welcome, Naomi, and thanks for joining us on Underlying Conditions.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
So, Naomi, let's start just briefly and talk a little bit about your new book. You were just recently a guest at CSREA, right before the lockdown, as a matter of fact, and you delivered a terrific lecture that our viewers can access on YouTube. On our website, and it was about your new book, Bans, Walls, Raids, and Sanctuary. It was timely before the pandemic, but it's even more so now. Can you just spend a couple of minutes describing for people what the current, how your work puts these current practices of immigration policy in historical and intellectual context?
Yeah, so basically the book talks about basically our current immigration crisis right now, right? And I think it was motivated in part by Trump's election, right, in 2016, and then seeing the response, a lot of the response to it, because he rode to the White House on this explicitly racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant kind of tidal wave. But the response was also a lot of organizing among immigrant justice activists, as well as their allies. And a lot of that organizing happened under the kind of banner of sanctuary. So I was like, how do we kind of understand these two things together? And what the book argues is that, yes, Trump highlights, he kind of sheds light on these deep immigration, anti-immigrant sentiments, rhetorics, and policies, right? But they don't emanate from him, right? He's not the source of it. And so if we're going to get real about having a real immigrant justice movement, then we have to think about the long history that has brought us to this moment of crisis. And that history goes all the way back to the founding moment of the United States, as well as to the origins of immigration restriction in the late 19th century. So what I do is that each of the first three chapters takes one of Trump's key kind of executive orders, so the Muslim ban, the border wall, and then ICE raids, and historicizes them to those two origin points, right? And talks about how if we really want to combat the Muslim ban, the border wall, and ICE raids, then we have to think really deeply and historically and take seriously how foundational these policies are to the US as a nation state. And so part of the argument is that, you know, the problem is not about Trump. The problem is the United States of America. And if we take that provocation, I understand that that's a provocative statement, but if we take that provocation seriously, then it means that we have to think much more deeply about how we got here and what we're going to do about it, because these problems are not going to go away once he's out of office, whether it's next year or in 5 years.
Right. I'm wondering how you have been sort of living with the reality of this pandemic in light of your research, because your research must bring you into pretty close proximity with, you know, riveting but also painful stories. I'm wondering if you have a striking personal or professional anecdote that you'd like to share that kind of captures the current moment with respect to immigration and the coronavirus crisis.
So, I mean, I need to preface this by saying that I am extremely privileged. You know, I can work from home. I'm still getting a paycheck. I can shelter in place, right, and still meet my daily needs. And there are millions of people who can't do those things. And so, you know, my experience of the pandemic is one of extraordinary privilege. And I would say professionally, what has been frustrating is kind of seeing how our institutions are not really taking into account how disparately our students and our community members are being affected by the coronavirus crisis. So, you know, just moving everything online is not really a solution to what we're dealing with, right? And I think that there's a kind of willful turning away from those disparities. So that's a kind of professional thing. I would say, in terms of personal stories, I spoke with a friend yesterday, because I had seen on her social media, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, that her grandmother was not doing well, and had been hospitalized because of COVID. So I had texted her when I saw that and just, told her I hope she's doing well and that I'm sending prayers and everything. And then at that point, the grandma was seeming to do okay. And then I checked in with her yesterday, and her grandma had passed in the morning. When I had originally texted her, she had also said that it wasn't just her grandma, that 7 members of her family had confirmed infections. And she has a large extended family. A lot of them live in Chicago. They're very close knit, and they all live within a 10-mile radius of each other. So she has like this big, wonderful family connection, but that also means that her family is composed of multiple intergenerational households, right? Which is not atypical. And so when one person becomes infected, it can spread through the family fairly quickly. So she, like many of her family members are continuing, and she herself, they're all continuing to go to work. And some of her aunties and cousins work in places where there have been outbreaks, like in factory settings, right? And that also is another kind of workplace setting where you can't really socially distance yourself appropriately. And so, but the thing is, they need to go to work, because if they take any vacation days, then they will be fired, right? And so that's not really an option for them. So they continue to go to work. And then a couple of the, I think a cousin and a couple of aunts got infected potentially at work and then brought it home.
So I mean, this sort of segues into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, there's this illusion that's, I think, driving Trump's effort to close the border, which sort of suggests that it will stop the pandemic, right? But it seems that, this is going to have a pretty extraordinary impact on immigrant communities. Can you speak to the ways this complete closure will impact them and, across our various borders? And do you think such a closure would reduce the spread of the virus?
So let's think about these so-called emergency immigration policies under COVID, right? They are not new, which means that they are not about COVID. He has been wanting to shut down the border since before he took office, right? They've been clamoring for that big, beautiful wall, like a shutdown of immigration, like deporting anybody who doesn't have papers, and so on, for years, right? So none of this is about public health. Right? And we can actually look at the executive order that suspends immigration, which the full title is very long, but it's basically who present risk to the US labor market, right, during the economic recovery following the outbreak. So even the very language of his policies is not about public health. It's not motivated by public health. It's motivated by other things, right? And so I think that, but this doesn't mean that coronavirus doesn't matter. COVID has created a crisis, which, kind of following Stuart Hall and Ruthie Gilmore, means that the social relations that we currently have can no longer hold under the current social conditions, right? And so what they're following a very kind of neoliberal Milton Friedman-esque kind of gathering up of what crisis enables, right? It makes the formally impossible seem inevitable, right? And so the formally impossible, like closing down the border, now becomes, they can mobilize this crisis in a way to make it seem like the only thing we can do or we should do to protect the US public, right? But none of it is about that, right? And even if shutting down the border and not issuing new immigrant visas were motivated by public health, they would be ineffective. Right? I'm obviously not an epidemiologist, but it is the US that has the highest infection rates in the world. It is the US that has the most COVID-related deaths in the world. It is the US that cannot get its act together to have mass testing, right? And so, like, US people are spreading COVID to each other within the United States. It's not coming from outside at this point. So, you know, this is basically a mobilizing of a standard trope of outbreak narratives, right? That infection always comes from somewhere else, right? And it's always some other kind of problem. And we see this, you know, the way the White House is mobilizing this kind of discourse in terms of its anti-Chinese rhetoric, its insistence on calling it the Wuhan virus, which is then fomenting, you know, racist violence against Asian people in the United States, right? And so, and, you know, like, as you said, like, there's a completely disparate and disproportionate effect of the virus on different kinds of communities, right? So, I mean, I think that, you know, this isn't about public health at all.
Right. And actually, you know, what's very interesting about the lengthy bill that you mentioned, emphasizing, you know, the labor market, is that the opposite appears to be quite true, that immigrant labor, much of which is undocumented, is considered essential, but now exposed, right? So, you know, the coronavirus situation has further exposed the degree to which the U.S. relies on labor of migrants, the undocumented and low-wage workers, in nearly every facet of American life. So many essential work sector roles, such as what we're hearing about more and more every day now in meat packing and food processing, grocery store clerks, delivery truck drivers, they're being performed by undocumented immigrants. In fact, you know, I think it was just recently that the U.S. government declared farm workers as essential to the food supply chain during COVID-19, but 2/3 of the farm workers in the U.S. are undocumented immigrants. So, you know, it just exposes the fundamental contradiction that you're really describing here. So it seems that the most this punitive response might do is help spread the disease among undocumented workers on whom we depend, rather than keeping them out through excessive border patrols. Have you heard much about how these located workers are finding higher rates of infection because of this kind of contradiction?
I feel like it is inevitable that we're going to see high rates of infection among these kinds of workers. I mean, we've already seen crises in the food supply chain around meatpacking plants, like these huge industrial meatpacking plants, where they've had massive outbreaks of coronavirus among its workers because, again, they can't socially distance themselves appropriately, and they're working in an environment where, you know, like, viruses can spread. You know, it's likely that, you know, Rob Wallace wrote that book, Big Farms, Big Flu. I mean, the kind of emergence of new infections has a lot to do with our food production systems, right? And you know, I think it's ironic that, you know, it's coming back to U.S. meatpacking plants. But I feel like it is inevitable that we are going to see infections spread from these kinds of workplaces, right? And just going back to that executive order that I just mentioned, right? That's about protecting we need to shut down immigration in order to protect U.S. workers. Who's exempt from that executive order, right? It's low-wage migrant laborers, right? Who come to the U.S. on a seasonal basis through things like H-2 visas, right? And so on the one hand, you have like this sweeping anti-immigrant policy and rhetoric, right, which then mobilizes a shutdown of the border and a shutdown of visas. But it also functions as a mode of labor discipline for non-citizen workers, especially those who are undocumented. Because are you actually going to go to work and be like, I'm not coming to work today unless I have personal protective equipment or whatever, if you're undocumented?
The labor discipline you're talking about is extreme for the undocumented, but it is a pattern for low-wage workers across the board.
Right. And it's like, as we kind of further Walmartize the economy, this is like a shared condition among workers, right? And again, this is not a coronavirus thing. This has really deep roots, right? The coronavirus kind of makes it visible and maybe speeds things up in a way that makes us more aware of them, but it's built on a sturdy foundation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's one of the premises of the series that we're doing, Underlying Conditions, is that we want to look at things that are being brought to the surface as a result of COVID-19, but that they are in fact underlying conditions that create the circumstances that we're finding today. What about detention centers? Is there any sort of new and important information or ways of understanding what's going on in detention centers in light of COVID-19? I mean, we knew they were horrible, overcrowded, lacking sanitation, and
Right.
limited health services from the beginning.
Right.
And that's a disease spreading condition. But do we have any data or any information from people about the ways in which these detention centers or the people in them are responding to COVID and the risks that it might pose?
The ACLU just published a report documenting the conditions in ICE detention centers, which it describes as dangerously unprepared for coronavirus outbreaks, which should seem like the most obvious statement in the world, right? I also saw that last week, at least 450 detained people tested positive, and 35 ICE employees at detention centers have tested positive as well. And this is just among those people who got tested, right? So 45% of those tested were confirmed to have the virus, but the testing is extremely limited, right? So the actual numbers of infections, as is the case in other places, right? Like we don't have mass testing, is unknown. So we don't actually know what percentage. We don't actually know how many. We don't actually know who is infected with coronavirus within these detention centers, right? And ICE has also been prioritizing testing migrants who are slated to be deported, right? Rather than those who are slated to stay in detention for a while longer, right? And so even though ICE has released about 700 migrants who are considered vulnerable, like older people or people with pre-existing conditions and stuff, it still imprisons more than 34,000 people in these basically petri dishes, right? And, again, coronavirus accelerates a problem, but it is not the cause of the problem, right? Detention is the problem, right? It's a setting where people are already treated as if they are disposable. Like they have already been eating inedible, maggot-infested food. They have already been living in like hazardously filthy conditions, right? They have already been deprived of medical care, right? And so like the coronavirus just exploits all of those conditions to make it basically turn a short-term detention, right, into a death sentence, into a slow motion death sentence.
Right. Yes. That is a very serious part of this situation that is exacerbating to an immediate life and death situation.
Right. And this is the case with any detained person too. This is not just about immigrant detainees. It is also about incarcerated people in a variety of settings.
So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the concept of sanctuary and both, just describing it as something that is important in your work, but more specifically, can you talk briefly about what you think sanctuary means in times like this? What might we take away from the use of the term and the practices of sanctuary in a time such as this crisis?
Yeah, so like the way that I conceive or conceptualize sanctuary is it's fundamentally about reshaping and recasting our relationships to each other. And it is built around mutual accountability and mutual responsibility for each other without limitation or restriction of any kind, right? So it seems like a pretty simple concept, but we find ways to not do this as a society all the time. So we create all these artificial divisions amongst each other, like citizen foreigner, that prevent us from holding ourselves accountable to each other, right? And I think coronavirus, it should show the necessity of seeing our relationships to each other as essential. Like your health and your well-being directly affects my own and is essential to me in a very literal way, right? So I need to make sure that you have what you need to stay well and healthy, like access to medical care, food, shelter, sanitation. If you're a healthcare worker, then PPE, and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Naomi Paik. This is fantastic. We really appreciate you sharing your insights and your stories and struggles with family and friends with us on underlying conditions. We hope to see you back at Brown as soon as possible. Take
Yeah,
care.
I would love to. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.